Charles Bronson physically threatened Lee Marvin on set. Marvin had failed to show up for a scene again. Bronson found him. Whatever was said between them, Marvin showed up after that. And by the end of this video, you will understand why that confrontation between two men who had both actually been to war was the most honest moment on the entire production. Think about being 12 years old and watching 12 of the toughest men on Earth being handed a mission that was designed to get them killed. No polish, no heroes in the traditional sense, just dangerous men with dangerous histories, given one chance to mean something. The Dirty Dozen made $45 million on a $5.4 million budget. It was the highest-grossing film of 1967. It launched careers, funded independent cinema, and proved that an audience would rather watch flawed men doing impossible things than perfect men doing easy ones. And the story behind it is every bit as rough as the film itself. If you grew up with films like this, the ones that treated you like an adult before you were one, this channel was built for you. Subscribe before we start. We are here every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and we are not going anywhere. Let's go. Number 10. John Wayne. Said no. Jack Palance said no. Both had the same objection. John Wayne and Jack Palance were among those who turned down roles because they objected to their characters' behavior. The premise of The Dirty Dozen, that the heroes are rapists and murderers, that the men being sent on a mission to kill German officers are themselves convicted killers, was too much for both men. Wayne loved the script. The producer and MGM originally offered Marvin's part of Major Reisman to John Wayne. The actor loved the script, except for the detail that Reisman was having an affair with a married woman, and worse, that the woman was married to a soldier away at war. He would not play a man who did that. He had a specific image of what American heroism looked like, and it did not include this. When John Wayne turned the part down, Aldrich's original choice of Lee Marvin was approved by MGM. The man who had actually been to war, who had actually been wounded in battle, said yes to a role that the man who played war heroes on screen found morally uncomfortable. Sometimes the real thing and the performance of the real thing are very different qualifications, and Marvin was not the only veteran on that set, not by a long distance. Number 9. Half the cast had actually been to war. They were playing convicts. Lee Marvin served in the U.S. Marine Corps. He saw action as a scout sniper and was injured during the Battle of Saipan. Charles Bronson served in the U.S. Army Air Forces. He flew 25 combat missions over Japan aboard a Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Ernest Borgnine served in the U.S. Navy. Telly Savalas served in the U.S. Army. George Kennedy served under General George Patton and saw action during the Battle of the Bulge. 5 of the film's principal cast had personally served in the conflict the film depicted. They were not imagining what war looked like. They were not researching it in libraries or listening to veterans describe it. They had been there. They had smelled it and survived it and carried it back in their bodies in ways that no acting class could replicate. And they showed up on a film set in England in 1966 to play convicted murderers and rapists being sent on a suicide mission, and brought everything they actually knew to roles that were designed to be the furthest thing from heroes. The weight you feel watching this film, the specific heaviness of it, comes from men who earned that weight in places nobody was filming, but not everyone stayed for the whole production. Frank Sinatra had other plans. Number 8. Frank Sinatra fired one of the Dirty Dozen mid-production by phone. Trini Lopez's character, Jimenez, dies in a parachuting accident early in the Dirty Dozen. Frank Sinatra, who had signed the singer to a recording contract, insisted that Lopez drop out of the much-delayed production and get back to the recording studio, as Lopez typically recorded about 4 albums a year for Sinatra's Reprise records. Trini Lopez did not choose to leave. He was removed. Sinatra ran a recording label. Lopez was under contract. The label needed product. The film could find another actor. Lopez was written out mid-production. His character killed in a parachuting accident because the script needed to account for his disappearance, and sent back to a recording studio in Los Angeles because a man who was not in the film decided his time was better spent elsewhere. The parachuting accident that ends Jimenez early was not a creative choice. It was a scheduling conflict enforced by the chairman of the board, and the Dirty Dozen went on without him. One man shorter than the title promised. And the man who remained had a specific problem that was threatening the entire production. Before we keep going, here is the question that matters. How old were you the first time you watched The Dirty Dozen, and who introduced it to you? Because this film was not discovered alone. Someone put it on, a father, an older brother, a friend who said just watch. Drop both answers in the comments right now. How old and who was there? Number 7, Lee Marvin kept not showing up. The director kept waiting. The cast kept filming around him. It's well known that Lee Marvin struggled with alcohol throughout his life, and his drinking became a serious issue during the filming of The Dirty Dozen. Hyman once said that Marvin was a no-show for a pivotal scene with Bronson, who played Ladislaw. The lead of the film, the man whose name was on the poster, was not on set when he was needed. Director Robert Aldrich had built his entire production schedule around a man who was not reliably available for it. The crew adapted, they filmed around him, they shot other scenes, they waited, and then they waited some more. Everyone adored Lee Marvin, said the production coordinator. He was funny, charming, very professional when he was there. When he was there, he was everything the film needed. When he wasn't, a film set in England with 12 actors and a full crew had to find ways to fill the hours. The gap between what Lee Marvin could be and what Lee Marvin sometimes was, that gap ran through the entire production. And one of his co-stars eventually decided to close it personally. What happened next has never been fully reported. Number 6, Bronson found Marvin. The conversation was not polite. Marvin showed up after that. Charles Bronson threatened Lee Marvin directly on set. Marvin had been absent for a scene. The production had stalled. Bronson, a man who had flown 25 combat missions over Japan in a B-29, went and found his co-star and made clear that the absence needed to end. What was said between them has never been fully reported. What is known is the outcome. Marvin returned to set. The scene was filmed. The production moved forward. Think about the specific weight of that confrontation. 2 men who had actually been to war. 2 men who understood what it meant to show up when you were needed. Because in the actual war, not showing up had consequences that a film set could not replicate but could at least take seriously. Bronson did not go through the director. He did not go through the producer. He went directly to the man. And whatever he said it in the language of someone who had earned the right to say it. Marvin heard him, and Marvin showed up. And on that same set, quietly, someone was making something that would change cinema entirely. Number 5, Cassavetes used his paycheck to fund his own film and changed American cinema forever. John Cassavetes was Oscar-nominated for his role as Franco, the defiant mobster who becomes a hero. Cassavetes now had the money to finish Faces, 1968, and go on to make some of the most influential independent films in America. Cassavetes was not primarily a Hollywood actor. He was an independent filmmaker who took acting work in commercial films to fund the films he actually wanted to make. The Dirty Dozen paid him enough to complete Faces, a raw, improvised portrait of middle-class marriage and desperation that became one of the foundational texts of American independent cinema. Every independent film made in America since 1968 exists in the shadow of what Cassavetes built, and the money that built it came from playing a mobster in a war film. The commercial film funded the art film. The Dirty Dozen paid for everything that followed. You never knew what he was going to do or what would come out of his mouth, the production noted. Cassavetes' penchant for surprising everyone eventually paid off with a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination. And on the same set, in a role so small it nearly wasn't filmed at all, another career was about to begin. Number 4, Sutherland's role was almost cut. It led directly to Hawkeye Pierce. Vernon Pinkley, played by Donald Sutherland in the role that landed him the MASH movie. Sutherland's role in The Dirty Dozen was small, nearly peripheral. His character, Vernon Pinkley, spends a significant portion of the film pretending to be a general during a war game sequence. The comedy is subtle, the performance is specific, and it was almost not filmed because the production was running behind schedule, and peripheral characters were the first casualties of the schedule. The role survived. Sutherland filmed it. And when director Robert Altman was casting MASH in 1970, looking for someone to play the irreverent anti-authority army surgeon Hawkeye Pierce, he had seen what Sutherland did in The Dirty Dozen. the small role, the specific quality of a man who found the absurdity in the authority structure around him and refused to take any of it seriously. Altman called him, Sutherland said yes, and Hawkeye Pierce was born from a role that almost didn't survive a scheduling cut on a film set in England in 1966. And then there is The Running Man and the moment that stopped an entire audience cold. Number 3, Jim Brown's first film, One Run, an iconic action sequence, and a career that started here. Ex-NFL star Jim Brown makes his film debut, and his broken play run while setting off the hand grenades is one of the action genre's most iconic scenes. Jim Brown was, at the time of filming, one of the greatest running backs in NFL history. He had never acted in a film before, and the sequence that would become the most discussed action moment in the film, Brown running through a compound, carrying grenades, moving with the specific physical authority of a man who has spent his professional life breaking through lines of men trying to stop him, was essentially Jim Brown doing what Jim Brown did. The choreography was minimal. The physicality was authentic. The camera watched him move and understood immediately that it was seeing something it had not seen before on screen. The film careers of both Jim Brown and Donald Sutherland exploded as a direct result of their appearances in the film, One Run, on a film set in England, in a man's first ever screen appearance. The most athletic scene in a film full of veteran actors doing things they had done before, performed by the one man who had never performed anything for a camera in his life. And when the film opened, the most powerful critic in America tried to stop it. He failed completely. Number 2, the most powerful critic in America called it dangerous. The audience disagreed loudly. When The Dirty Dozen opened, many critics reacted with undisguised horror, none more strenuously than the New York Times' Bosley Crowther, then approaching the end of nearly 3 decades on the job. Crowther had been the most influential film critic in America for most of his career. His reviews moved audiences, his opinions shaped the conversation, and he looked at The Dirty Dozen and wrote a review calling it morally reprehensible, arguing that the film's celebration of violence and its sympathetic treatment of murderers was genuinely dangerous to public morality. The audience went anyway. The Dirty Dozen became the highest-grossing film of 1967. It was not close. The film that Crowther called dangerous outsold everything else released that year by a significant margin. Audiences looked at 12 imperfect, violent, morally compromised men being given one chance to do something that mattered and recognized something in it that no critic's horror could override. The film that was supposed to corrupt American morality became the film American audiences chose above everything else that year. Crowther retired from the Times later that same year. The two events are related only in timing, but the timing is hard to ignore. And then, on set, during a quiet moment, a group of real veterans were asked a question, and what they said about themselves is one of the most honest things any actor has ever said about any role. Number 1, real soldiers, playing convicts, having the last word. Lee Marvin served as a Marine Scout sniper and was wounded at the Battle of Saipan. Charles Bronson flew 25 combat missions over Japan. George Kennedy served under General Patton at the Battle of the Bulge. Ernest Borgnine served in the U.S. Navy. On set, during production, a reporter asked several of the cast how it felt to be playing soldiers of lower rank than they had actually held in the real war. The conversation that followed has been quoted in various forms for nearly 60 years. Kennedy said, "Took me 2 years to make private first class." Marvin said, "I didn't even make that in the Marines." Borgnine revealed, "I was beneath notice in the Navy." And then Marvin looked at all of them, the decorated combat veterans playing convicted murderers in a Hollywood film about a war they had actually fought, and said, "For punks, we're doing all right. I wonder how the generals are doing." Real men who had been to the real thing, sitting on a film set in England, playing the worst kinds of soldiers the war had produced, and finding, in that gap between what they had been and what they were playing, exactly the kind of dark humor that men who have been through something only they understand use to process it. That is The Dirty Dozen, a film made by veterans playing villains, funded by a studio that wasn't sure it would work, condemned by the most powerful critic in America, watched by more people than any other film released that year, and anchored, in every frame, by men who brought something to it that no amount of preparation could have manufactured. They had been there. You could see it, and they knew you could see it, which is why nobody who has ever watched this film has ever quite forgotten it. Tell us in the comments who introduced you to the Dirty Dozen.